Welcome to the Mary Mavis Show, the show that focuses on remarkable results and your personal power. Here is your host, Mary Mavis.
I feel super privileged today to introduce my guest. Sandra Morgan recently retired from HCA Healthcare as the Senior Vice President focused on physician and healthcare provider relations. Prior to HCA, she held numerous commercial leadership roles in pharmaceuticals. Today, we're going to talk with Sandra about her key lessons learned in assimilating into the culture of an organization. But before we get into that, I'll also share with you how Sandra and I met. We met when she was at Pfizer. She was the Vice President of Managed Care. And I was working with her as well as conducted a leadership program. And the interesting part of that in reflection, Sandra, is that was very early days of all of my frameworks and thinking that have turned into the chapter called People Are Funny, and the work around influencing, using what you know about people to go in their door. And we did that as your team thought about what did they know and how could they be more effective with their customers. So that's a little bit of context for how I know Sandra. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. And Mary, it's so fun to see you again and talk with you. And we remember that session fondly. I'm still in touch with that team at Pfizer, many of them.
That's great. Yeah, good.
Really
All
helpful.
right. So you're going to tell a story about how, so take us from, and I think the story that you said might make sense would be transitioning from the role at Pfizer into HCA Healthcare, and give us some context for the lesson you're going to share or the wisdom you're going to share from that experience.
So anyone that's worked in Manhattan or lived in the Northeast knows the train. And I was going to run for the train. My phone rang, and out of the blue, it was late in the evening, a headhunter called. And she started talking about a company called HCA Healthcare. And I was frankly quite happy at Pfizer, but she just blew my mind. And it sounded like a really neat opportunity to start a brand new function within a 40-year-old company. And so the next day, through some contacts, I ended up talking to Rick Schlesinger, who at the time was a senior partner at McKinsey, and he's now retired. And in fact, he's become my retirement coach. But Rick, I called him and said, I don't know you, but I was contacted and I heard that you used to know this company, HCA Healthcare. Well, it turns out he'd helped write the job description. He knew a lot. And so after talking with me just a few minutes, he sized me up pretty well. And he said, well, Sandra, I'll tell you right now, something that you really have to think about is culture. You come from a sales and marketing machine. You come from that culture at Pfizer and the other pharmaceutical companies. And HCA Healthcare is an operations culture. You talk fast. You're a fast-talking New Yorker. And I protested, no, I'm from the Midwest. I'm a Midwesterner. And he pointed out, in the South, that's still called the Northerner. And that you can't talk like this and you have to fit into the culture. And I was trying to get my head around what he meant by operations culture. And then he said, and I've used this 100 times since, and I've got goosebumps, Mary, right now as I say it. Don't go there and be an organ rejected by the body. Try to fit into the culture. And that has been one of the key lessons of my entire career. And so that's the context of it. If you want me to share what happened, you want me to go into that?
Yeah, go right into it. So you interviewed and you got the job.
Yeah. And then I started listening and observing, and frankly became a student of culture. And culture, simply put, is how people think and act. And so I really just watched people, observed, and one big aha moment was they know where I come from. They know I don't know hospital operations, and they were so warm and welcoming as long as I asked. So I needed to ask them to fill in my gaps, and it turned out that I was their gap filler. They didn't know anything about it, building a sales organization or the kind of customer relations that I'd become accustomed to. So we were nice gap fillers, loved it. But even when I joined smaller teams, micro teams, I've always tried to watch for the culture. How do people think and act in this culture? So that served me well.
So what do you think, what was the, what did Rick maybe intuit, rather than that you were a Northerner, that would be difficult for you? What was the potential misfit or the place where you had to find your fit in the culture?
Oh, Mary, that's a great question. It's really, the misfit was a salesy culture versus an operations culture. That was the core of it. And a salesy culture means, you're, I called it, and I love Pfizer to this day, but it's a culture of positivity. It's a culture of things are kind of great. I mean, we could speak up, of course, but it was a lot of positive feedback, coaching style. You could make decisions later. You didn't have to make them now. The culture at an operations company, HCA Healthcare is the largest non-governmental healthcare company in the United States. You make them on the spot. That emergency room's on fire immediately, or not on fire. Emergency room is got something going wrong, or something just happened. You fix it then. You literally are operating everything you do. You make decisions faster. You're also very strategic in the background, but you're on it. It's a 24/7 kind of job. And it's not salesy. You go into and I mean that with all due respect to me and my profession and everyone else out there, but you don't go into meetings and just say what you think they want to hear. You go into meetings with more candor. You've got to speak up. You've got to tell them. And since we have when I was there, we had 50,000 physicians at HCA, our job was to share what we heard from them. Sometimes it wasn't all the most positive. There are things that need to be fixed. And so that was our job, sharing them. And I always felt empowered to speak up.
Did you find some of that out in the interview process, given that you had or how difficult was it to figure out the culture in the interview process?
Well, it was amazing. There were 8 hours of interviews, 8 different people, 9 to 5 basically. And the first person really didn't interview me at all. He spent his entire time, and he was a group president, phenomenal man. He's since retired, but he spent his entire time telling me about the company. In hindsight, he understood that I didn't know. He understood that there's no way she knows this. She doesn't know what she's getting into. So that was brilliant. And then they brought in a few people that turns out they were my future team members, and they explained things. So they knew what they were doing. And Mary, you told me to say this. I don't even know if you remember, but when I finally got to the end of the day, and I'd already met the CEO and everyone, but then I met my boss, who's president, and I told you, Mary, in advance. I said, I've got gaps. When they figure out my gaps, they're going to not want me. And you said they know you have gaps. They want what you do have. So just say, after today. And it came by very honestly to me, I'm more excited than ever. But I'll tell you, compared to what you're looking for, I have about a 30% gap. And my boss, Bruce, got a huge smile and he goes, we know that. We know. But what you have, we don't have. And he said, I know the hospital industry and all of us really, really know it. So we'll fill in your gaps and you can help us fill in ours.
Right.
And so in hindsight, it was probably a 50% gap. I didn't mean to exaggerate with 30, but, or underestimate, but anyway.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to know how they made the decision if, 80% of the interview was telling you about their culture, making sure you knew what you were getting into.
Yeah.
So that you would make a good decision, I think. Sounds like.
Yeah. And there were follow-up interviews and things where I think they went a little deeper. How would I go about it? I gave them a 30, 60, 90-day plan, all those things that you probably taught me.
Yeah. So now you've accepted the position. It sounded like the way that you entered in was observing, paying attention and listening. What else did you do, and where did you find the biggest challenges of fitting in?
In sales and marketing, that kind of background I came from, you have your own language. they operations and people at HCA have their own unique HCA language, their own acronyms, like we did in managed care at Pfizer. They have their own way. So really just understanding. I still remember the CEO at the time. I said pre-call planning and post-call analysis to him, and he just winced. Now, they'd said plenty of things like that in front of me about operations, different phrases that I didn't know, but I remember, try to fit in. I'm here now. And he said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "Oh my gosh." He goes, "You sound like a consultant." And I said, "Well,
yeah, really, really bad."
yeah. But it didn't sound as, he wanted me to speak in layman's terms. And I said, what it really means is before you go in and talk to someone, you just got to plan it. And afterwards, you see how it went, what you do differently next time. And so from then on, I learned to use different language, just down to earth language, nothing that came from my past training. And that really worked until the end of time. I think when you observe people and you don't know things, I remember watching our CEO ask someone in the boardroom. He said, and this was a senior meeting, he said, "I don't know about that project. Tell me more." And I was sitting there thinking, I don't know about this project. I don't even know what anyone's talking about. And it just empowered me instantly that if he could ask a question and he didn't know something and he admitted it, then I certainly could too. And so I always ask questions, and people ask me a lot of questions. I quickly caught on. My skill that was almost generic at Pfizer was quite unique at HCA Healthcare.
Yes, right. And it's so interesting because when you start a new big job in a culture that or a type of organization that you don't understand, I think it's often the tendency to try to convince and impress them that you do know what you're talking about. Right? Who wants to go in and say, "Well, I don't really know most of what you're talking about"? But it sounds like you tested the waters and then found that that you were asking questions was really a part of the culture.
Yes, and it was. I felt very safe. Now, one question I asked of a gentleman, he was a CFO, a group CFO, and I looked at him, I said, "I'm so happy to talk to you because I want to know where we make our money." That is a pretty naive question for most industries. And he just sketched it out on a piece of paper in the simplest terms. And that made me feel safe too. He could have said, "What are you doing here? You don't even understand our business model." But they just knew it cold and they like to teach. So I don't know if that works at every company, but because if I had been in operations for 20 years, and then I switched from one hospital operations company to another, I probably wouldn't have felt as free to ask those basic questions. But because I was such an outlier, it's completely fair game. It was fine.
It's interesting. I once worked with a partner at a consulting firm that was an amazing guy, and he was close to retirement. And he would go into a client, and it didn't matter how much he knew about the industry. He would always say, "I'm going to ask you a lot of questions because you know more than I will ever know about this business." And he just, that was the first place where it's sort of like, I just have to have really good questions. And you find that people love to talk about their business, about their role, about their challenges. And in that initial part of acclimating to a new organization, it's so important to ask questions and to not be worrying about looking good, unless you've oversold what your capabilities are, and that actually would make you even more nervous, right?
Yes, I couldn't agree more, and it is so amazing. And I think in sales you learn quickly. This is a little bit of a gross sounding way, but you'll never forget it. We always tell people, show up, don't throw up. And so when you go in to see the customer, you want to listen. You're never learning anything if you're talking, obviously. So the only time, and if you can master that. So my sales training and background came in to play where you just listen and they want to talk about themselves and they want to share what they've done. And I have a real curious mind anyway, and so it worked. But I never, ever felt that it was, I was ashamed for not knowing something. Nobody, they love teaching, that's who they are. So.
Yeah, most people like talking about themselves and what they do. So you came in the door aware that it was a very different culture, aware that you had big gaps. Your two approaches, at least two parts of your approach, were to observe and then to ask questions. Did you find that there was any part of the culture that was just a real hard part of the culture for you? Like that you said, well, I want to make sure that the body doesn't reject the organ. But were there some hard things that were just, you had to learn to be a different way?
I like early on, my boss said, Sandra, you're like Midwestern apple pie with a New York edge. And I remember thinking, what did he mean by New York edge? I'm not sure. And he and I are still great friends, and he's a wonderful person. So I asked him, he's like, no, don't take offense to that. I just mean you'll be direct. And then when we were hiring my replacement, when I retired as a senior officer and he was looking for someone, he said, Sandra, I need someone like you. And I said, well, what specifically? And he said, someone who will speak up in the board meetings in a way, and senior officer, and really any meeting, in a way that doesn't offend people, but you'll get it out. And so we can't lose your voice. And so that was nice. I felt like it was always okay. But sometimes I think in one-on-one conversations with the kind of Southern culture and things, more than just the HCA, but more the South, people aren't as direct. And I'm pretty direct. And so sometimes I can be direct and sometimes I can't. I found myself saying, you're looking for permission, people I mentor, people that would come, or you're looking for feedback from me, you're asking me, so tell me, do I have your permission to be as candid as I think you want me to be? Do you want me to be candid? And they'd say yes, and that would let me open up. I don't like to have to beat around the bush. And sometimes I think that was probably a different, more a Southern thing. Just you take a little bit longer to say something, and it's a little less direct.
Well, or a similar. I have had a lot of clients talk about the fact that they have a really polite culture.
Yes.
That they're not going to put the elephant on the table. Not for everyone to see. They might pull it out and look at it together, a couple of people, but they're not going to put the elephant on the table. And if you're used to sort of just being really candid, that can be a problem because you can end up with miscreating, creating some negative impact without intent.
Right.
And did you have some missteps?
I'm sure that I did. I think sometimes one-on-one, I had more missteps. In meetings, I'm more careful. I'll use certain ways to do it. I'll take a minute to explain the background. And I'll sometimes not say it's my concept. I'll say, here's what we heard the physician say. We got 20,000 comments back in our survey, and this is what they said. I read them all. And then you're sort of safe. You can still be careful. But in one-on-ones, I think of some direct reports or people that I mentored who would say, I love feedback. I'm crazy for feedback. Now, another thing about me, maybe this is part of my funny or uniqueness or something, is that I'm literal. So if you tell me, hit me right between the eyes with feedback, I think you mean it. And so there's a friend at work, a phenomenal HR person. I'm sure he'll let me use his name, Steve Taylor. And one time I told him and he said, oh, Sandra, they don't mean it. They don't mean that at all. And sure enough, this one person who I probably had a little more, trouble with the personal relationship on the surface, it seemed great. Over time, it was probably a little strained. I was very direct and candid with her because she told me, hit me between the eyes. And when I did, I thought, this is great. Like, we can both save time. You can hit me too, It didn't mean it at all. What she really was saying is, I want tons of positive feedback. And he pointed that out to me. And that was very helpful. He said, that's not what she's looking for. But so, yeah, definitely a few missteps.
Yeah. So, interpreting what people are telling you from their lens on the organization or their lens from, when you talk about the South, I mean, it's a very unique culture. If you're having to deal with people in Germany or Sweden or Asia, those are very different cultures. So I think what you're saying is that you can't really, you can make a lot of assumptions about the words people use to describe how to be successful in their organization. So you really do have to find your way into the culture.
Yeah, exactly. And, Rick Schlesinger also said to me, Sandra, don't try to change the culture to a sales and marketing culture. And, I might have tried. That was brilliant advice.
Right.
Because you think, well, I'm coming here and this isn't like me. And so I'm going to try to morph it to be like me in my comfort zone, when really I think you said, just try to fit in. You have to fit into their culture. You're not going to change the culture. Nor should I have tried. It wasn't a sales and marketing company. So I think that is really helpful when you realize, try to fit in, make sure that you're trying to adapt.
I think if people are listening to this and you say, fit into the culture, it's like, it sounds like you have to not be yourself. Yeah. You have to be not that, rosy Midwesterner with a New York edge. You have to not be yourself. You have to be something else. You have to be like us. So is that true?
No, but I can see why, people might think that, listeners might think that. You really get to be yourself with a little more emotional intelligence about a subject. So you just think about, how would this be perceived by them? And I sort of have to be myself. I can't do that. I wouldn't have been happy. I would have had to leave, even if they didn't kick me out, for being so different. They I think liked how I was, and I liked how they were, and we were our authentic selves. However, I had to think a little differently in the beginning. Now later, I'm probably one of them now, right? So I was there 13 years. So
yes.
Yeah,
probably. Yeah. But also, if you think about what is a culture, it is the pattern, the most common pattern of action, ways of thinking across the organization. And it doesn't mean that every single person is exactly the same. Right. So, I mean, that gives you some leeway. How can I fit in and still be myself? And there are some cultures. I mean, I once interviewed for a company where they basically, I won't tell you the name of the company, but very early on in my career, and in the recruiting process, they said, we are a cutthroat company. In our company, we expect employees to step over each other to be successful in their career. I was like, okay, this is not for me. I'm just like, I didn't get called back, and I was really glad that I didn't get called back. So the nuance that you're talking about is the style and, pattern of making decisions and communicating and relating to each other as a part of the culture. So it doesn't mean that you have to fit in you can also expel yourself if for some reason it's a really not a good fit for you.
Right. I agree completely.
So, so you fit in.
Yes.
And you probably changed the company in some ways.
Possibly.
Yeah. So were there some really positive surprises about the process for you?
Just the amount of learning that you get to do when you're listening and you're trying to fit in. I did get to learn more. And then just the friendships that are formed that way. When you let people talk more and listen and you're learning from them, I found most people like to teach. Most people like to share. Most people like to be valuable to you. So I think it more deeply bonded me with other people. Like our relationships were a little deeper earlier because of it.
Yeah, and I think also the top advice I have for everyone starting a new job, and it doesn't matter whether they're at the top or early in their career, is to go in and make sure you spend lots of time understanding the people, asking good questions, asking things about, how did decisions get made here? Rather than what we often try to do is go in and get the job done, demonstrate that we're going to get results right away, or that we can get the task completed. And so it's a really a great demonstration of you had a heads up. You walked in observing and listening and questioning and finding the way to also be yourself and be valued for your uniqueness. All the way to the point that when you retire or in the process of retiring, that they want someone more like you. That's a wonderful thing. So, Sandra, one of the chapters in my book is people are funny. And that's not funny, ha-ha. People are unique. And in this question, it's about do you uniquely challenge people? Your way of being that challenges people. So how are you funny? And then tell us, if you were working for someone just like you in that funniness, what would you suggest people do?
So 3 things quickly come to mind. One is I have a dream big mentality. I wake up in the morning with fully fledged ideas in my head. I mean, it's just who I am. I've always been that way. But that dream big mentality can some really worry some people, concern some people. They don't see it. They have to come around. The second one is passion. I'm passionate. I'm passionate about kind of everything. I'm passionate about cheeseburgers and I'm vegan. It's really anything. And that passion can come across as strong or very high energy. And then the third is I have high expectations and set the bar high. Magically, teams perform and succeed and honestly exceed my expectations. Even though they're pretty high to begin with, they usually knock it out of the park. But that doesn't mean there's not some uncomfortable moments when they first hear it.
So how do you think it makes them uncomfortable?
Well, let me just go piece by piece. With the Dream Big, a gentleman on my team who's now since started his own company, Brian Freeman. Brian is amazing, and I would say things, and he never said no. These were ideas, and he never ever said no. And he used to say, Sandra, gosh, I didn't think that could really happen. I didn't say no at the time. But we reflected recently because we're still great friends. And he said, 100% of the ideas always worked out. But that day he would have definitely bet, maybe 20% of this could work and the rest wouldn't. But he bought me Steve Jobs' book and he wrote a long opening to it. And he said, there's something in here called distorted reality. Now I'm 1/1,000,000th of a Steve Jobs in terms of ideas. But it reminded him this distorted reality, which means no one believes for a second that it could be done, like crazy. And I'll give you an example. I wanted to have my 400 team member at the time. There were 400 physician provider relations directors, and I wanted to get them all together. Well, that's really expensive. And as operators, you run narrow margins. And finally, I realized we were never going to have them together. So I wanted to have a big virtual meeting. And my idea for this big meeting was it would be 3 days, which is obnoxiously long, and it would be highly engaged, and we would see them and they could see us. And at the end of every day, my threshold was if I didn't feel like I was with all 400 of them, it was just a WebEx. And so I went in and I pitched that. Now that sounds like nothing today, does it? This was 8.5 years ago.
Exactly. Before anybody was used to being on FaceTime.
No camera, no FaceTime, no cameras on. And we also had the moxie, I don't know what to call it, to invite our founder, Dr. Frist Jr., who everybody loves, Dr. Tommy Frist Jr. And so he was going to be there. So it made people even freak out a little bit more. So he was on camera. Everybody could see him. And then everybody who wanted to ask a question came on camera. And he would see big groups of people at a time, and they asked him questions. And he looked at me and he said, they can see me and I can see them. I'm like, yes. We walked out and he said, why, Sandra, how much money do you think that just saved our company? Well, I hadn't done all the math, but I said $1 million. The truth is it would have saved more than $1 million. And he said, imagine if we did that company-wide. And now he's a dreamer because obviously he didn't start a company worth $80 billion without being that, but it still felt really good. So things like that. But when I have to support him along the way, because I kind of say it, and then honestly, well, I'll stay involved and I'll give ideas, and I am a solutions person too. I usually sort of walk out of the room and they're the ones doing all the work. But in the end,
Yes.
We're like high-fiving. We're cheering. I'm so proud of them. I can't stand it. I mean, it's unbelievable. They get the glory and they do great work, but they're always the ones stuck with it. And I think that's what makes them even more nervous, is they know it's not worked out. But
Well, if you put those three things in together and say you've got a big vision that you're very passionate about, and it raises the bar for everybody who's involved in pulling it off, then, all three of those, I would think that one of the things that, of course, there are always going to be people that say, yes, let's do that. But I think what we often, people who are thinking big, don't realize is that people listen through the lens of, will I be able to perform? Will I be able to perform? And the more they work for you, my guess is, will I be able to perform for Sandra? Because no doubt I want to perform for Sandra. And so it makes me anxious. I can't see that it could happen, and I'm not sure I can. Sometimes it's just I can't see that it could happen. But often that ends up being, I don't know what I could do or should do or would do to make that happen. So Sandra, if someone's working for a big thinker who has a lot of passion and very high expectations, and all of a sudden they have this picture that they're thinking, no way is that going to happen, what would you suggest somebody do?
Well, there was one person on my team who really handled it well. And if I were kind of pitching something, he would hold up his hand like a stop sign, brilliant. And he would say, remember, Sandra, well, that sounds great. Now, he was an expert in communication, so he did it beautifully. That sounds great. But remember, I'm a processor. Will you let me have a few days to process this? And you know what? I'm not a processor like that. And I thought that was brilliant. The first time he said it, I leaned in. I'm like, that's the best thing I've ever heard. What a good idea. Not for me, but for you. That's awesome. So I'd say yes. So one thing, if you are a processor and you have to sleep, and frankly, mine's fully like in my head before I even tell you. So it's brand new to you. So it's usually brand new to most people like that. So say, can you say that again? Or will you describe it for me? You know what? I can describe it to the nth detail because it's a picture in my head. And so ask me to describe it. I'm going to have fun describing it, and then you're going to understand. And then a lot of really smart people, when I'm funny like that, will say, and so what's the end game? What's the ultimate goal? Is this just because it's an idea? Or is this because like you had another idea? Or is it for some good of the group? And so I don't realize they don't always have all that in their head. And it really helps me. And it's very fun. So I think if you ask a leader who's funny like me and you ask them to slow down and explain and tell a little bit more, they're going to like to do that. Like that's really fun for them. And they also forgot that you don't know those details. You weren't in their dream. You didn't see it, the show, so slow. Yeah. And then usually if you're assigned with working on it, I would say, ask the person, I've got a few ideas of my own. I've got a few thoughts, but I want to be very deliberate and disciplined. What you're doing is getting yourself out of being put on the spot to come out with the answers. Nobody expects that, but you may feel the pressure like you're going to say something, and just say, let me think about this. I want to be deliberate and disciplined about it. It's a big idea. It sounds great, but I want to be very thoughtful. May I get back with you and get time in your calendar next week to run a few ideas by you to see that I'm on the right track, and also to share any new thoughts and ideas I might have that may take it in a slightly different direction. I love that, especially when they proactively, put appointments on the calendar. And anybody usually, again, with my personality, style, my funniness, would like that. They'd like those check-ins. And just because they dream big, it doesn't mean that you can't dream even bigger. I mean, they come back with ideas that are better, and they think that mine's set because it sounded like it was written in ink. And I just erase it and say, that's better. I love that better. I wish I would have had that concept. So don't be afraid to come in with your own ideas, because what this is, and Mary, you may have taught me this too. My gosh, all this is coming back. Thought transmission. If I say it's sunny and you say I'm hungry, then I get to say, let's go to lunch outside. And it looks like it was my idea, but you made me think it. So I saw a ton of thought transmission happening where I would say something in rough draft form and they came back with a far better finished product. And that was brilliant. I love that they did that. So.
Yeah. And, there isn't any one answer, because there is only one Sandra Morgan. And certainly a lot of big idea people would have a similar view, but not everybody would. So the important thing is to step back and think about, what do you know about the person? What are their patterns? Are they a big idea person who then becomes defensive if you ask a question? And yet, I think you're right. I think a lot of people who, myself included, who have big ideas, it's not that they're going to, if you challenge them or question them or have some new ideas, if you come out confidently and supportively, like, that is an awesome vision, and I just don't understand part B. Can you take a little bit of time and tell me more about how can I help? I'd like to help by asking a question to, shape out part B a little bit better so that I can understand it. And I think if you're a big picture person, you love having people engage in your picture.
Yeah.
You might not change, but the fact that they have a good question about it usually is a positive.
Yeah. And my learning with the person who said, let me process this, was they don't want to respond at all in the moment. So that was a good aha for me. The rest of the people sort of winged it and tried to respond. And I should have said, this is my learning, I should have said, you don't need to respond to this right now. Why don't you go home and sleep on it? Instead, by my sheer energy, passion, enthusiasm, they felt that they had to sort of respond with some answers and insight. And it was the first time they ever heard of it. So I love that. So buy yourself some time if you need to, and that's expected.
And the more that you tell people, like this person, if the more that you have a direct report who really needs to process it, then they're doing a good job for themselves by declaring, look, I'm not everybody, but I need time to process this. So that's wonderful. That's not funny, haha, and it's not so funny challenging, but I know exactly what you mean by really creating some anxiety for people around you when they don't immediately check in with your big picture. So let's go to the third piece, which is what's your personal power. So this is obviously not your authority power. It is what makes you effective that is a part of your style. And you've indicated things that are a part of your style that make you effective. But how is it, what struck you by this question in terms of your enduring personal power, no matter where you are?
I think it's caring for people. I mean, people know I care. There's a book called The Oz Principle I love about accountability. And part of the Oz Principle is see it, own it, solve it, do it. Well, to see it, it requires feedback. We often can't see it. I always say, if I had pepper on my tooth right now and we did this whole podcast, Mary, and you saw me and you didn't tell me, I would just be mortified. But maybe you don't want to tell me because you think it'll somehow sting me. It's going to sting me more when I find out later. And so I've always found that feedback, if we wouldn't do things that we do if we saw what others see. So feedback is so vital. I'm really into it. And that means I give feedback. And I do think it's a gift, but it doesn't mean it doesn't sting. And so this caring, in the Oz principle, there's a part that talks about who do you give the most feedback to? And so I ask that when I teach it. And they say, your children, of course. I'm like, why do you give the most feedback to your children? They say, because I care the most for them. I'm not going to do it for a stranger on the street, but for my kids, I'll give them the feedback. So I try to explain that about me to people, and I show that I care. I find out about their families. They can tell me, hopefully, just about anything, and many do. And I think because I care, I can get away with the feedback because they know I adore them, and I think the world of them, and I think they're superstars. And oftentimes they've asked me to be their mentor as well, which I like them to have a separate one, of course, too. But I think just caring, I really do care deeply for them and want to celebrate their successes. And that goes pretty far. I think we all like to know that we're cared for.
So that's the down and around for the people that are directly reporting to you. Does that translate into how you interact with senior people as well?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So do you have the same experience of dealing with difficult topics or problems that caring, becomes the smoother, the entry point, everybody knows, that you're saying this out of caring for the organization, for the person?
Yeah, I do think they do. I've got some pretty great relationships with the other senior officers. I mean, you kind of bond together. There's 23 in the company, and you sort of have things that you don't want to talk. You can't always talk to other people about certain things that you're not, maybe confidential, et cetera. So you bond. It's best when if I have like a one-on-one. I'm still, in fact, I've had. Now we're back to masking and not going out. So we've been having Zoom cocktail hours, and my husband and I, just our favorite thing is to just have like one person with their spouse, if they have one, with us, and we just talk, because I found, in hindsight, that I didn't always spend as much time as I should have getting to know them. And now in retirement, because I've got all this time on my hands, I'm asking more questions and finding out their background and learning that so-and-so loves to do puzzles and other things. So if I went back, I probably would have done more dinners and lunches, but I'm a bit of a workaholic, a lot of a workaholic, and I just didn't take the time for that. So that's one thing I would change. But I do think they knew that I cared for them and I valued them, and I didn't have this agenda that was opposing it. And I, what I say is going to be the same. I'm in front of you or behind you. And so I do think I had some pretty meaningful relationships with them, and there's just kind of a tight bond. They're great people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know exactly when, maybe 7 years ago, I did some interviews with clients. I was redoing my website or something, and I was looking for sort of where's the value of my work, and what really made a difference, and examples of impact. And one of the threads through what people appreciated about my coaching is that I care about them, that they felt they had somebody as a partner in their success. And I was so struck by that because I do care, but I didn't realize how important it was. So I was thinking about it as coaching, you illuminate the problem, you help them with insights, you give them ideas, and you coach them when they call you in the middle of the night and whatever it is. And so I've been really more cognizant of that as at least very important. And so if you if that's a way of being, I can see where that would ease you into very difficult conversations if people already know that you're a caring person.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're a pretty tough person, hard driving person.
Mm-hmm.
So caring doesn't have to mean that you're soft.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Mary, I've got to brag on your book for a minute. And first of all, you were my coach, and because I loved you and thought you did outstanding, I've had other executive coaches. I send people to you, even my own sister. She wouldn't mind me saying that. And I think your entire book, when I read it, is a culture of caring. The book is like wrapped into caring. I'm like, you're saying these things, and she used to say some of these things to me, and I still thrive off things you said. And I even reminded you when we were talking about doing this together. Well, Mary, remember when you said this and that? And some of it you'd long since forgotten. Oh my gosh, people on my team have heard the name Mary Mavis. They probably think I was still closely working with you or something, but I've just fed off them. But I think your entire book is a culture of caring. There's no doubt that you care. And I think you taught me a lot about that as well, just to take the time to tell people and make sure they understand it's in that culture.
Well, it started out of leaving as a legacy with my clients some of the core concepts that I've worked with them on. And that was really the underlying purpose for writing the book. And I will tell you that I heard through the first readers that they thought it was a perfect book for young leaders, which is why we're sitting here today, because it really ignited my interest in bringing what I've done with people like you as the vice president of sales or somebody else in a leadership role to people who are early on in their career and can make good use of the very same concepts. So, Sandra, thank you for that plug on the book. I appreciate that. I appreciate you. And I'm really happy you could join me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mary. You're amazing.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Today's show was produced by Eric Aubrey. Our theme music was written and produced by Eric Aubrey and Tim McKinstry. The show's graphics were designed by Devin Marciano. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on Google, Apple, or Spotify. You can also find episodes at maviscompany.com, where I invite you to sign up for my weekly newsletter. I hope you use some nugget to help you create remarkable results in your world. Thank you for listening.